I bought 7 different cheap spark plug brands, all under $4 per plug, and ran them through 30,000 kilometers of real-world driving in my 2016 Honda Civic. Same engine, same fuel, same driving conditions, just rotating through different plug brands every time one failed or hit severe performance loss. And the results? One brand made it to 30,000 kilometers still firing clean with barely any electrode wear. Another brand started misfiring at 11,000 kilometers, destroyed my fuel economy, and nearly took out my catalytic converter before I caught it. By the end of this, you'll know which cheap spark plug actually works and which ones are just scrap metal that happens to spark for a few thousand kilometers before turning your engine into a shaking, fuel-guzzling mess. Let's get into the test that took 18 months, one very patient Honda engine, and a code reader that got more use than I ever wanted. This wasn't a laboratory dyno test or some sponsored comparison with pre-selected winners. This was a long-term, real-world durability test using my daily driver, a 2016 Honda Civic LX with the 2.0-liter naturally aspirated 4-cylinder engine. This engine uses a simple coil-on-plug ignition system, takes standard 14mm thread plugs with 16mm hex, and calls for NGK or Denso from the factory. The test rules were straightforward and measurable. Start with brand new spark plugs from each manufacturer. Run each set until either they hit 30,000 kilometers, performance degraded beyond acceptable levels, or they caused engine codes. Document fuel economy every tank using the same gas station and pump. Monitor for misfires using a Bluetooth OBD2 scanner that logged misfire counts in real time. Every 3,000 kilometers, pull one plug for visual inspection, measure electrode gap with a wire gauge, and check for abnormal wear. Drive in mixed conditions, including 60% highway, 30% city, and 10% short trips under 5 kilometers to simulate real-world use. Keep oil changes consistent at 5,000 kilometer intervals using Honda Spec 0W20 synthetic. The OBD2 scanner stayed connected permanently, logging every misfire event, fuel trim correction, and ignition timing pull. I used the Torx Pro app to track long-term fuel trim, which tells you when the engine is compensating for poor combustion. And every time I switched to a new plug brand, the old set went to a local mechanic who inspected them under magnification and gave an honest assessment of what killed them or how much life remained. I started with the generic store brand because I wanted to establish the absolute baseline for cheap spark plugs. These plugs come in plain cardboard packaging with minimal information beyond the heat range and thread size. No brand heritage, no engineering claims, just the cheapest thing that will thread into your engine and produce a spark. Installation was straightforward. Gaps measured 1.1 millimeters out of the box, which is exactly spec for this engine. First start was normal, idle was smooth, and for the first 2,000 kilometers, everything seemed fine. Fuel economy averaged 7.8 liters per 100 kilometers on my regular commute, right where it should be. Then around 2,400 kilometers, I noticed the first misfire count logged. Cylinder 3 recorded 2 misfires during a cold start. Not enough to trigger a check engine light, but concerning. At 3,000 kilometers, I pulled cylinder 3 for inspection. The electrode showed abnormal wear, with the center electrode measuring 1.3 millimeters gap, 0.2 millimeters beyond spec. That's excessive gap growth for just 3,000 kilometers. By 5,000 kilometers, fuel economy had dropped to 8.4 liters per 100 kilometers, a 7% loss. The OBD2 scanner showed long-term fuel trim at plus 8%, meaning the engine was adding 8% more fuel to compensate for incomplete combustion. At 6,200 kilometers, the check engine light came on. Code P0303, cylinder 3 misfire detected. I pulled all 4 plugs and found cylinder 3 electrode gap had opened to 1.5 millimeters. The insulator was darkened and sooty. The ground electrode showed pitting. Game over for the generic brand at just 6,200 kilometers. The mechanic who inspected them said the metal quality was poor, probably low-grade copper that couldn't handle thermal cycling. He predicted these plugs would have completely failed by 10,000 kilometers if I'd kept running them. Final verdict on generic store brand? Absolutely inadequate for any real-world use. Failed in under 7,000 kilometers with measurable performance loss. Caused 7% fuel economy degradation and misfires. Only suitable for emergency roadside repair when you're stranded and need any spark plug immediately. Second in the test was Autolite Copper Core, the budget American Standard priced at $2.75 per plug. Autolite has been making plugs since the 1930s, and they're found in every auto parts store in North America. These plugs feature a solid copper core center electrode and nickel alloy ground electrode. Gap measured 1.1 millimeters out of the box, perfect to spec. Installation was smooth, first start was normal, and initial impressions were positive. For the first 8,000 kilometers, the Autolite plugs performed exactly as expected. Fuel economy held steady at 7.8 liters per 100 kilometers. No misfires logged. Idle was smooth and consistent. At 9,000 kilometers, I started seeing occasional misfire counts, usually 1 to 3 per cold start, but nothing sustained during warm operation. At 10,500 kilometers, I pulled cylinder 2 for inspection. The electrode gap had opened to 1.25 millimeters, acceptable but showing wear faster than premium plugs would. The insulator showed light tan deposits, indicating normal combustion. By 12,000 kilometers, fuel economy had slipped to 8.1 liters per 100 kilometers, a 4% loss. Long-term fuel trim was showing plus 5%, mild but measurable compensation. At 14,800 kilometers, the check engine light triggered. Multiple cylinders now showing intermittent misfires. I pulled all 4 plugs and found electrode gaps ranging from 1.3 to 1.4 millimeters. The center electrodes showed visible wear with rounded edges instead of the sharp corners they started with. The mechanic's assessment was that these plugs were wearing normally but accelerated, probably good for 20,000 kilometers maximum in ideal conditions, but not suitable for 30,000 kilometer service intervals. Final verdict on Autolite Copper Core: acceptable performance for the first 10,000 kilometers. Wear accelerates noticeably after that point. Failed before 15,000 kilometers with misfires and fuel economy loss. Good for budget-conscious drivers planning to change plugs every 10,000 kilometers, not adequate for extended service. Third was Champion Copper Plus at $2.85 per plug, another old American brand with strong name recognition. Champion markets these with their UltraSeal coated shell to prevent corrosion and a patented V-trim ground electrode. Out-of-the-box gap measured 1.1 millimeters, right on spec. The plugs installed smoothly with clean threads and proper seating. For the first 5,000 kilometers, the Champion plugs performed well. Fuel economy stayed at 7.8 liters per 100 kilometers. No misfires logged at all. Idle quality was excellent. At 6,000 kilometers, I noticed a subtle change in throttle response. The engine felt slightly less crisp during acceleration. Nothing dramatic, but noticeable. At 7,500 kilometers, I pulled cylinder 1 for inspection. Gap had opened to 1.3 millimeters, faster wear than expected. The insulator showed darker deposits than normal, suggesting the plug was running slightly rich. By 9,000 kilometers, fuel economy dropped to 8.2 liters per 100 kilometers, a 5% loss. More concerning was a rough idle that developed when the engine was fully warm. The OBD2 scanner showed sporadic misfires across all cylinders, 2 to 4 per minute at idle. At 11,200 kilometers, the check engine light appeared. Codes for cylinder 1 and cylinder 4 misfires. I pulled all the plugs and found something interesting. The center electrodes had developed a mushroomed shape where the tip had actually melted and reformed. This indicates the plugs were running too hot for the application. Gap measurements were 1.4 to 1.5 millimeters. The mechanic explained that Champion's copper alloy might not have the thermal conductivity needed for modern engines with hotter combustion chambers. Final verdict on Champion Copper Plus? Started strong but degraded quickly after 6,000 kilometers. Electrode mushrooming indicates heat management problems. Failed before 12,000 kilometers with multiple cylinder misfires. Not recommended even for budget applications. Fourth in the rotation was Bosch Copper Plus with yttrium at $3.20 per plug. Bosch markets these with a copper core for better heat dissipation and yttrium-enhanced ground electrode for longer life. The German engineering reputation had me hopeful these would perform better than the American budget brands. Gap measured 1.1 millimeters out of the box. Installation was clean. Initial performance was impressive. For the first 12,000 kilometers, these plugs felt noticeably better than anything tested so far. Fuel economy held rock solid at 7.8 liters per 100 kilometers. 0 misfires logged. Throttle response stayed crisp. At 13,000 kilometers, I pulled cylinder 3 for inspection. Gap measured 1.2 millimeters, excellent wear resistance. The electrodes looked clean with minimal deposits. The center electrode showed even wear with no mushrooming or pitting. This was promising. But at 16,500 kilometers, something changed. I started getting random misfire codes, never the same cylinder twice. The pattern was erratic. 3 misfires on cylinder 2 one day, 5 misfires on cylinder 4 the next day. Fuel economy dropped to 8.0 liters per 100 kilometers. At 18,000 kilometers, I pulled all the plugs for inspection. Gap measurements were excellent, ranging only from 1.2 to 1.25 millimeters, but the insulators showed a strange orange discoloration near the tip. The mechanic identified this as heat stress cracking in the ceramic. Apparently, the Bosch plugs were thermally cycling in a way that stressed the insulator material. He predicted these would cause increasing misfire issues even though the electrode wear was minimal. At 19,400 kilometers, the misfires became constant at idle. Check engine light was on permanently. I retired the Bosch plugs at 19,400 kilometers, not because the electrodes failed, but because the insulator was failing. Final verdict on Bosch Copper Plus? Best electrode wear resistance of the budget brands tested. Fatal flaw with insulator heat stress cracking. Failed before 20,000 kilometers due to insulator degradation, not electrode wear. Interesting option, but the insulator issue makes them unreliable for high mileage use. Fifth up was ACDelco Professional Conventional at $3.35 per plug. ACDelco is General Motors' parts division, and these plugs are designed to meet GM OEM specifications. They feature a solid copper core, ribbed insulator to prevent flashover, and nickel alloy ground electrode. Gap measured 1.1 millimeters out of the box, perfect. The plugs installed smoothly with high-quality threads. From the first start, these plugs felt solid. Idle was glass smooth. Throttle response was immediate. For the first 15,000 kilometers, the ACDelco plugs performed flawlessly. Fuel economy held steady at 7.8 liters per 100 kilometers. Zero misfires logged. No rough idle, no hesitation, no complaints. At 16,000 kilometers, I pulled cylinder 2 for inspection. Gap measured 1.2 millimeters, excellent. The center electrode showed minimal wear. The insulator was clean with light tan deposits. The ground electrode had no pitting. Everything looked textbook perfect. At 20,000 kilometers, I did another inspection. Gap had opened slightly to 1.25 millimeters across all 4 plugs, still within acceptable range. Fuel economy remained at 7.8 liters per 100 kilometers. The OBD2 scanner showed zero correction in fuel trim. The engine was running exactly as it should. At 25,000 kilometers, I inspected again. Gap measured 1.3 millimeters, getting close to the upper limit but still acceptable. Fuel economy had dropped slightly to 7.9 liters per 100 kilometers, barely 1% loss. One misfire logged on cylinder 1 during a cold start at minus 18 degrees centigrade, but nothing during normal operation. At 28,500 kilometers, I started seeing more frequent cold start misfires. 3 to 5 counts per cold start, usually clearing within 30 seconds. At 29,200 kilometers, the check engine light appeared with code P0301. Cylinder 1 misfire. I pulled all the plugs and found gaps ranging from 1.35 to 1.4 millimeters. The electrodes showed significant wear with rounded tips and the beginning of ground electrode erosion. The mechanic said these plugs had reached end of life through normal wear, not premature failure. They'd done their job well. Final verdict on ACDelco Professional Conventional. Excellent performance through 25,000 kilometers. Gradual wear led to misfires approaching 30,000 kilometers. Best value in the budget category for drivers needing reliable 20,000 to 25,000 kilometer service life. Highly recommended for anyone running conventional copper plugs. Sixth was Denso Standard at $3.50 per plug, one of the 2 Japanese OEM options. Denso supplies spark plugs to Toyota, Honda, Nissan, and other manufacturers as original equipment. Their conventional copper plugs use a pure copper core and special nickel alloy electrodes. Gap measured 1.1 millimeters perfect to spec. The build quality was immediately noticeable. The threads were precisely machined. The hex was perfectly formed. The insulator had a quality finish. These plugs just looked better than the others. Installation was smooth. First start was instant. Idle was absolutely smooth. Smoother than anything else tested so far. For the first 20,000 kilometers, these plugs were invisible in the best possible way. They just worked perfectly. Fuel economy held at 7.8 liters per 100 kilometers without any variation tank to tank. Zero misfires logged. No rough idle ever. Throttle response stayed crisp. At 21,000 kilometers, I pulled cylinder 3 for inspection. Gap measured 1.15 millimeters, incredible wear resistance. The center electrode looked almost new with sharp edges. The insulator was perfectly clean, with minimal deposits. The ground electrode showed no pitting. At 26,000 kilometers, another inspection showed gap at 1.2 millimeters. Fuel economy still 7.8 liters per 100 kilometers. No misfires. No issues at all. At 29,500 kilometers, approaching the 30,000 kilometer target, I did a final inspection before retiring them. Gap measured 1.25 millimeters across all 4 plugs. The electrodes showed wear, but were still within service limits. Fuel economy had slipped barely to 7.9 liters per 100 kilometers, essentially unchanged. The OBD2 scanner showed zero fuel trim correction and zero misfires logged in the last 10,000 kilometers. The mechanic who inspected the used plugs said they had at least another 5,000 to 8,000 kilometers of usable life remaining. Final verdict on Denso Standard: flawless performance through 30,000 kilometers with minimal wear. Could have continued beyond 30,000 kilometers. Best build quality and most consistent performance of any plug tested. Absolutely worth the 50-cent premium over budget options. The final plug in the test was NGK Standard at $3.50 per plug, the other Japanese OEM supplier. NGK supplies spark plugs to more vehicle manufacturers worldwide than anyone else. Their conventional plugs use a solid copper core and trivalent metal plating on the shell. Gap measured 1.1 millimeters. Build quality matched Denso with precise threads and clean finish. Installation was smooth. First start was instant. Idle quality was excellent. For 30,000 kilometers, the NGK plugs performed essentially identically to the Denso plugs. Fuel economy stayed at 7.8 liters per 100 kilometers through the entire test. 0 misfires logged at any point. No rough idle, no hesitation, no complaints. At 12,000 kilometers, I inspected cylinder 1. Gap measured 1.15 millimeters. Electrode wear was minimal. At 22,000 kilometers, another inspection showed gap at 1.2 millimeters. Perfectly normal wear. At 30,000 kilometers, the final inspection showed gaps between 1.2 and 1.25 millimeters depending on cylinder. Fuel economy was still 7.8 liters per 100 kilometers, unchanged from the beginning. The mechanic inspected the plugs and said they looked like they had 15,000 kilometers on them, not 30,000. The wear rate was remarkably low. He estimated these plugs could go another 8,000 to 10,000 kilometers before needing replacement. Final verdict on NGK Standard: identical performance to Denso through the full 30,000 kilometers. Minimal electrode wear. 0 issues. Either Japanese OEM option delivers outstanding value and reliability. After 30,000 kilometers and testing 7 different cheap spark plug brands, the results were undeniable. Most cheap plugs failed before 20,000 kilometers. Only 3 brands completed the full test, and only 2 performed flawlessly with minimal wear. Here's the ranking from worst to best based on longevity, performance consistency, fuel economy impact, and electrode wear. 7th place goes to the generic store brand. Failed at just 6,200 kilometers with severe electrode wear. Caused 7% fuel economy loss and misfires. Poor metal quality led to rapid gap growth. Only suitable for emergency use. Avoid completely. 6th place is Champion Copper Plus. Failed at 11,200 kilometers with electrode mushrooming. Heat management problems caused early degradation. Started well but degraded rapidly. Not worth even the low price. 5th place goes to Autolite Copper Core. Failed at 14,800 kilometers with excessive electrode wear. Acceptable for first 10,000 kilometers, then degraded. Could work for 10,000 kilometer service intervals but nothing longer. Better options exist at similar price. 4th place is Bosch Copper Plus. Failed at 19,400 kilometers due to insulator heat stress cracking. Excellent electrode wear resistance. Fatal insulator flaw makes them unreliable. Interesting engineering, but ultimately unsuccessful. 3rd place goes to ACDelco Professional Conventional. Reached 29,200 kilometers before misfires from normal wear. Excellent performance through 25,000 kilometers. Best value in the American budget category. Recommended for 20,000 to 25,000 kilometer service intervals. 2nd place is NGK Standard. Completed 30,000 kilometers flawlessly with minimal wear. Could continue another 8,000 to 10,000 kilometers. Perfect fuel economy maintenance. 0 issues logged. 1 of 2 plugs that actually survived the test. 1st place and the clear winner is Denso Standard. Completed 30,000 kilometers flawlessly with minimal wear. Could continue another 5,000 to 8,000 kilometers. Perfect fuel economy and 0 misfires. Best build quality observed. The other plug that survived the test. Tied with NGK for 1st place because both performed identically. So which cheap spark plug should you actually buy? The answer is simple. Either Denso Standard or NGK Standard at $3.50 per plug. Both Japanese OEM suppliers delivered identical performance through 30,000 kilometers without a single issue. Both maintained perfect fuel economy. Both showed minimal electrode wear. Both could continue beyond 30,000 kilometers safely. The 50-cent per plug premium over budget. American brands is the best money you'll spend. 4 plugs cost $14 total, just $6 more than the cheapest options. That $6 difference buys you 15,000 to 20,000 extra kilometers of reliable service, elimination of misfire risk, and perfect fuel economy. If you calculate cost per kilometer, the Japanese OEM plugs are actually cheaper because they last twice as long. If you can only find one brand or the other, it doesn't matter. Buy whichever is in stock. Denso and NGK are functionally identical in this test. If you're extremely budget limited and need the cheapest option that won't fail immediately, ACDelco Professional Conventional at $3.35 per plug will get you 20,000 to 25,000 kilometers reliably. It's 60 cents cheaper per set than the Japanese options and performs well enough for most drivers. What you should absolutely avoid is the bottom tier. Generic store brands, Champion and Autolite all failed before 15 15,000 kilometers. If you've run cheap copper spark plugs and had them fail early, tell me in the comments what brand caused problems and at what mileage they died. Did they cause misfires, rough idle or check engine lights, or did you get lucky with a budget brand that lasted longer than expected? Your real-world experience adds to the data and helps other drivers avoid expensive mistakes. Because at $3.50 per plug, there's no reason to gamble on cheaper options that might fail in 10,000 kilometers when proven Japanese OEM plugs will reliably deliver 30,000 kilometers or more. The test results don't lie. Denso and NGK survived. Everything else failed. Choose accordingly and your engine will thank you with smooth running, good fuel economy, and zero misfire codes for tens of thousands of kilometers.